Night drives always had a strange appeal to me. The calm darkness of an empty highway felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of the day. But in January 2023, a late-night drive through a rural stretch of highway became the most horrifying experience of my life, one I can't fully explain. I had been visiting my parents in a small town in Missouri and was driving back to Kansas City. It was a cold, clear night, with snow still covering the ground from a recent storm. The moonlight illuminated the frost-covered fields, and my car's headlights cut through the darkness ahead. The highway was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. For the first hour, everything was normal. But as I approached a stretch of highway with an old, weathered overpass, I noticed something unusual. A figure stood on the overpass, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, the figure became clearer. A woman wearing a long coat, her hair flowing in the wind. She was standing perfectly still, her back turned to me. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I told myself it was just someone taking a late-night walk or waiting for a ride. As I passed beneath the overpass, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her still standing there. But she was gone. The road stretched on, endless and desolate. I turned up the radio to distract myself, but my unease lingered. I couldn't shake the image of the woman on the overpass. Then, about 10 minutes later, I saw her again. This time, she was standing on the side of the road, facing my car as I approached. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were locked on me. I slowed down instinctively, my heart racing. She didn't move or react to the car's headlights. Her expression was blank, but her presence was unnerving. I sped up, leaving her behind in the darkness. For the next 20 minutes, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see her standing in the road behind me. The highway was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. But just as I started to relax, the radio crackled with static. I reached for the dial, trying to tune it back to the station, but the static only grew louder. Then, through the noise, a voice whispered, "Turn around." I froze, my hand hovering over the radio. The voice repeated itself, clearer this time. "Turn around?" My breath caught in my throat as a wave of cold air swept through the car. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was sitting in the back seat. Her hollow eyes stared at me, her face expressionless. I screamed, swerving wildly as the car veered toward the shoulder. I slammed on the brakes, my hands shaking as the car skidded to a stop. When I turned around, the back seat was empty. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. The road was silent, and the snow-covered fields stretched endlessly in every direction. I debated turning back toward town, but I couldn't bring myself to retrace my steps. Instead, I gripped the wheel tightly and pressed on, determined to reach the safety of the next rest stop. The miles crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, up ahead, I saw a gas station. The station was old and run down, its flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows across the lot. I pulled in, desperate for a moment of reprieve. The clerk, an older man with a weathered face, greeted me with a nod. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual. I hesitated, debating whether to tell him about the woman. Finally, I said, "Have you ever seen anything strange on this stretch of road?" The man's expression darkened. "You're not the first to ask that," he said. "People talk about a woman out here. Shows up on the overpass or the side of the road. They say she's been dead for years." A cold chill ran through me. "What happened to her?" I asked. He shook his head. "Some say she jumped. Others say she was hit by a car. Either way, they say she never left." I thanked him and left the station, my mind racing. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Every time I pass an overpass or see a lone figure by the road, I feel a chill run down my spine, because I know that somewhere out there, she's still waiting, watching, for her next victim. Long-distance driving at night has always been my way of clearing my head. The quiet, the rhythm of the road, and the solitude feel comforting, even when I'm in the middle of nowhere. But one drive, late last summer, made me question the safety of even the most mundane stops. I was driving from Flagstaff to Las Vegas, a route that cut through miles of barren desert and sparse highways. It was nearly midnight when I set out, the perfect time for a quiet, uninterrupted trip. The first 2 hours were smooth, with the road almost entirely to myself. But as I neared the halfway point of my journey, the gas gauge started creeping toward empty. The stretch of highway I was on didn't have many stops, so I was relieved when I spotted a small rest area up ahead. It was one of those older ones, just a couple of pumps, a vending machine, and a dimly lit building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. I pulled in, parking under one of the flickering overhead lights. The place was deserted, the only sound coming from the occasional gust of wind rustling through the dry desert brush. I stepped out of the car, the air colder than I expected. The silence felt oppressive, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound you make. The pump seemed functional, so I swiped my card and began filling the tank. As I waited, I glanced around, taking in the eerie stillness of the place. That's when I noticed the building. The windows were dark, but something about it caught my attention. A faint light flickered inside, like a dying bulb struggling to stay on. I felt an inexplicable pull to go inside, though every instinct told me to stay put. Curiosity got the better of me. I replaced the pump handle and walked toward the building, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots unnervingly loud. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of mildew and stale air hitting me immediately. The interior was dimly lit, with outdated decor and shelves lined with dusty snacks. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. There was no response. I approached the counter, noticing a small bell sitting on it. I hesitated before tapping it lightly. The sound rang out, sharp and unnatural in the heavy silence. A moment later, a man emerged from the back room. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and eyes that seemed too wide for his head. His clothes were clean but outdated, like something out of an old movie. "Need something?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I forced a smile, trying to mask my unease. "Just wanted to see if you had a restroom." He nodded, gesturing toward a hallway at the back of the building. "Down there. Last door on the right." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl, but I nodded and thanked him, making my way to the hallway. The hallway was dim, the flickering light casting long shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. As I approached the restroom door, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. I pushed the door open, the hinges squealing loudly, and stepped inside. The restroom was small and dingy, the sink stained and the mirror cracked. But it wasn't the state of the room that unsettled me. It was the writing on the wall. Scrawled in shaky, red letters were the words, "Get out before it sees you." My heart raced as I backed out of the room, my eyes darting around the hallway. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a faint humming sound, like an old electrical wire struggling to function. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The man was standing at the end of the hallway, his head tilted slightly, his eyes locked on mine. I froze, the words on the wall replaying in my mind. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. I forced myself to respond. "Nothing. Just needed some air." He nodded slowly, his gaze never breaking. "It's a quiet place. Not many people come through here." I nodded, trying to keep my composure. "Yeah, I noticed. I should get going." As I turned to leave, I heard him speak again, his tone almost amused. "You'll be back." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't look back. I hurried out of the building and into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The car roared to life, and I sped out of the lot, the rest stop disappearing into the darkness behind me. But as I drove, something didn't feel right. The road ahead looked different, twisted, like it was leading me in circles. The signs I passed were the same ones I'd seen before, but they were in the wrong order. The gas gauge, which had been full, was now inexplicably nearing empty again. And then I saw it. The rest stop. It was exactly the same, down to the flickering light above the pumps and the faint glow inside the building. I slammed on the brakes, my breath catching in my throat. How was this possible? I'd been driving for nearly 20 minutes. I debated turning around, but the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere terrified me even more. Reluctantly, I pulled into the lot again. The building looked darker this time, the faint light inside barely visible. I stayed in the car, debating what to do, when I saw movement in the corner of my eye. The man was standing by the door, staring at me. This time, there was no doubt in my mind. I had to leave. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed out of the lot. As I sped down the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me. But the road behind me was empty. After what felt like hours, the road finally changed. The signs were new, the landmarks unfamiliar, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. When I reached my destination, I told myself it had all been a trick of my tired mind, a bad dream brought on by exhaustion. But every time I pass a rest stop at night, I feel a chill run down my spine, because I know that somewhere out there, the endless rest stop is still waiting for its next visitor. Late-night drives always had a mysterious allure for me, but one night, while traveling through a remote stretch of highway in Arizona, I experienced something so unsettling that I haven't driven alone at night since. It was October 2022, and I was driving home to Phoenix from a weekend in Flagstaff. The highway was a long, desolate stretch with no streetlights and barely any other cars in sight. The stars above offered the only light, twinkling faintly in the vast desert sky. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I kept the radio low, the tires humming on the asphalt as I passed miles of empty desert. But as I approached a stretch of highway that cut through a low valley, I noticed a line of trucks in the distance. They were driving in perfect formation, a convoy of 4 large semis moving at the exact same speed. Their taillights glowed red in the darkness, the trucks casting long shadows on the road ahead. At first, I thought nothing of it. Convoys were common on this stretch of highway, especially late at night. But as I got closer, something about the trucks struck me as odd. They were moving too slowly, almost unnaturally so. I switched to the left lane to pass them, but as I did, the convoy began to shift. The trucks moved in unison, blocking both lanes of the highway. Frustrated, I honked my horn, hoping they'd let me through. But instead of responding, the trucks slowed down even further, forcing me to match their speed. I stayed behind them for nearly 10 minutes, my frustration growing with every passing mile. Finally, the left lane cleared, and I seized the opportunity to overtake the convoy. As I passed the first truck, I glanced into the cab, hoping to get a glimpse of the driver. But the cab was empty. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the dark, vacant interior. The steering wheel moved on its own, guiding the truck with unnatural precision. I quickly turned my attention back to the road, my pulse racing. One by one, I passed the other trucks, each cab as empty as the last. By the time I passed the final truck, I was trembling. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the convoy vanishing into the darkness. But they were still there, their headlights glowing faintly as they continued down the highway. I pressed the gas, desperate to put as much distance between me and the trucks as possible. That's when the radio turned on. Static filled the car, loud and jarring, making me jump. I reached for the dial, trying to turn it off, but before I could, a voice broke through. It was faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. "You shouldn't have passed them," it said. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the radio, the voice repeating itself. "You shouldn't have passed them." I turned the radio off, my hands trembling on the wheel. But the voice didn't stop. It echoed through the car, low and menacing, even though the radio was silent. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The convoy was gone. The road behind me was empty, stretching endlessly into the darkness. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. But as I turned my attention back to the highway, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. The convoy was ahead of me. The trucks were moving slowly again, their taillights glowing like ominous red eyes in the darkness. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly as I came to a stop. The trucks were completely blocking the road, their massive frames forming an impenetrable barrier. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, one by one, the trucks turned off their lights. The darkness was absolute, suffocating in its intensity. I turned on my high beams, hoping to cut through the blackness, but the road ahead was empty. The trucks had vanished. I hesitated, my pulse pounding in my ears. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind. I decided to keep moving, pressing the gas pedal cautiously as the car crept forward. The road was clear, but the sense of unease lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights flickered and died. I slammed on the brakes, the car coasting to a stop in the middle of the highway. The engine sputtered, and the dashboard lights dimmed, leaving me in total darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its screen casting a faint glow in the blackness. But as I turned it on, I saw something in the distance. The trucks were back. They were lined up in perfect formation, their headlights aimed directly at me. A low rumble filled the air, growing louder and louder until it felt like the ground itself was shaking. The trucks began to move, their engines roaring as they sped toward me. Panic set in as I frantically tried to restart the car. The engine roared to life just as the trucks were about to reach me, and I swerved onto the shoulder, narrowly avoiding the collision. The trucks thundered past, their headlights blinding me as they disappeared into the night. I sat there for a long moment, my hands shaking on the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I finally regained my composure, I merged back onto the highway, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. But the trucks didn't reappear. The rest of the drive was uneventful, the road empty and silent. When I reached Phoenix, I told a friend about what had happened. They listened intently, their expression growing more serious with every detail. "You're not the first person to see those trucks," they said. "There's a story about a convoy that vanished on that stretch of highway years ago. They say the drivers were found miles away, but their trucks were empty, still running, like they were waiting for someone to drive them." I didn't know what to say. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, or the feeling of those trucks bearing down on me. Even now, I avoid driving that stretch of highway, especially after dark, because I know that somewhere out there, the convoy is still waiting. Late-night driving on rural highways has always been a double-edged sword for me. The silence is peaceful, but the isolation can be unsettling. One night, while driving through the mountains of Colorado, I learned just how terrifying that isolation can be. I was driving back from visiting a friend in Durango, heading toward Denver. The trip was long and winding, the highway cutting through dense forests and sharp cliffs. The road was completely deserted, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the fog that had started to roll in. The first few hours were uneventful. I listened to music, sipped coffee, and focused on the road. But as I neared a particularly sharp bend in the highway, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, standing on the shoulder, was a figure. As I got closer, I realized it was a man wearing a tattered jacket and jeans. His face was pale, and his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark. He was holding up a thumb, the universal signal for a hitchhiker. Normally, I wouldn't stop for hitchhikers, especially not at night. But something about the man seemed off. His stance was too stiff, his expression too blank. I slowed down, my heart pounding, but decided against stopping. As I passed him, he didn't move. He just stood there, his thumb still raised, his glowing eyes following my car. I couldn't shake the image of him as I continued down the highway. A few minutes later, I saw him again. He was standing on the shoulder, in the exact same position. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. There were no cars, no side roads, and I hadn't turned around. I stared at him for a long moment, unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and pointed directly at me. The gesture sent a chill down my spine. I hit the gas, speeding past him without looking back. The road twisted and turned, the fog growing thicker as I climbed higher into the mountains. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? How did he get ahead of me? Then, up ahead, I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder. Its hazard lights were blinking, and the hood was up. A woman stood beside the car, waving her arms frantically. My instinct told me to keep driving, but I couldn't just leave her stranded. I pulled over, rolling down the window slightly. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded, her face pale and her voice shaky. "My car won't start. Can you help me?" I hesitated. Something about her seemed off, just like the hitchhiker. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my distance. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously. "It just stopped. I don't know why." That's when I noticed something behind her car. In the shadows, barely visible through the fog, was the hitchhiker. He was standing perfectly still, his glowing eyes locked on me. I froze, my mind racing. The woman followed my gaze, her face twisting in fear as she turned to look behind her. "No," she whispered, backing away from the car. The hitchhiker stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I didn't wait to see what would happen. "Get in," I shouted, unlocking the passenger door. The woman didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the car, slamming the door behind her. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we sped away. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Who was that?" I finally asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer at first, her hands trembling as she clutched her coat. "I don't know," she said eventually, "but he's been following me for miles." We drove in silence, the tension in the car thick. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him behind us. But the road remained empty, the fog swallowing everything behind us. Then, just as I started to relax, the radio crackled. Static filled the car, loud and jarring, making both of us jump. Through the noise, a faint voice whispered, "You can't run." I turned off the radio, my hands shaking. The woman looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We kept driving, the highway stretching endlessly into the fog. Finally, we saw the lights of a small gas station up ahead. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot, the bright fluorescent lights cutting through the darkness. We got out of the car, both of us shaken but grateful to be off the highway. The clerk greeted us with a nod, his eyes lingering on the woman. "Rough night?" he asked. "You have no idea," I said, forcing a weak smile. We stayed at the gas station for a while, drinking coffee and trying to calm our nerves. When we finally decided to leave, the woman thanked me profusely and got a ride from a trucker heading in her direction. I never saw her again, but I'll never forget that night. Even now, I avoid driving that stretch of highway, because I know that somewhere out there, the hitchhiker is still waiting for his next ride. Late-night drives are supposed to be peaceful, a time when the highways are empty and the world feels still. For me, they had always been moments of calm, but one drive through rural Wyoming in February 2023 turned into a nightmare I can't forget. I was driving back to Denver from visiting a friend in Cody, Wyoming. The highway was long, barren, and surrounded by endless stretches of snow-covered plains. It was the kind of landscape that made you feel completely alone in the world. It was a little after midnight when I realized I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The road stretched on in a straight line, illuminated only by the glow of my headlights and the faint moonlight breaking through the clouds. That's when I saw the sign. It was an old, rusted highway sign that read, "Rest stop, 2 miles." I hadn't planned on stopping, but I was tired, and the idea of stretching my legs and grabbing a coffee sounded appealing. As I approached the rest stop, a small diner came into view. Its neon sign flickered faintly, the word EATS glowing in uneven bursts. The parking lot was empty, save for a single car that looked like it hadn't moved in years. I pulled in and parked near the entrance. The place had an eerie stillness to it, as if it had been abandoned for a long time. But the lights were on, and through the window, I could see a man sitting at the counter. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to keep driving, but exhaustion won out, and I stepped out of the car, pulling my coat tightly around me against the biting cold. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small space. The diner's interior was exactly what you'd expect. Worn red booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and a jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. The man at the counter didn't turn to look at me as I entered. "Help yourself," said a voice from behind the counter. I jumped, my heart racing as I turned to see an older woman in a stained apron. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Coffee?" she asked, holding up a pot. Yeah, sure," I stammered, taking a seat at the counter. She poured the coffee and slid it toward me without a word, her expression unreadable. I glanced at the man sitting a few seats down. He was staring straight ahead, his hands folded neatly on the counter. His clothes were old and worn, and his skin was unnaturally pale, almost gray. "Long drive?" the woman asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just trying to get home." She nodded, her eyes flicking briefly to the man before returning to me. "Be careful out there. This stretch of highway can be strange at night." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing again at the man before leaning in slightly. "Sometimes, people stop here and don't come back." I chuckled nervously, trying to mask my unease. "That's comforting." She didn't laugh. The man suddenly stood up, his movements stiff and unnatural. "I'll be on my way now," he said, his voice low and monotone. He turned and walked toward the door, but as he passed me, I noticed something strange. His eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless voids. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as he stepped outside and disappeared into the darkness. "What's wrong with him?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer at first. She just stared at the door, her expression grim. "Don't worry about him," she said finally. "Just finish your coffee and be on your way." I didn't need to be told twice. I downed the rest of the coffee, threw a few bills on the counter, and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. My car was the only one in the lot. The man's car, if it had ever been there, was gone. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between me and the diner as possible. But as I pulled onto the highway, I saw him. He was standing on the side of the road, his black eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, but no matter how far I drove, he kept appearing. Sometimes he was on the shoulder, other times in the middle of the road, forcing me to swerve to avoid him. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and the snow began to fall harder, obscuring my view. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. A gas station appeared on the horizon, its neon sign flickering faintly. I pulled in, my heart pounding as I parked beneath the bright lights. The station attendant looked up as I stumbled inside, my face pale and my hands trembling. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "There was a diner," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "And a man, his eyes, he kept following me." The attendant's expression darkened. "You stopped at the diner?" I nodded, confusion and fear swirling in my chest. "That place burned down years ago," he said. "It's not there anymore." I didn't argue. I didn't even ask questions. I just filled up my tank and left, the thought of that diner, and the man with the black eyes, still haunting me. Even now, whenever I drive that stretch of highway, I can't help but look for the flickering neon sign, because I know that somewhere out there, the diner is still waiting for its next customer. Driving long distances at night always feels like stepping into another world. The quiet, the emptiness, and the rhythmic hum of the road can lull you into a strange state of mind. But one drive through a remote stretch of highway in Montana turned into an experience that defied all logic. A night that still haunts me to this day. It was late October 2022, and I was heading to visit my sister in Great Falls. The route took me through the middle of nowhere, a winding highway surrounded by endless plains and dense patches of forest. The sun had set hours ago, and the road was illuminated only by the faint glow of my headlights. I was making good time, with the occasional song on the radio keeping me company. But as I rounded a curve, I noticed something unusual, a weathered road sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Hollow." The name didn't sound familiar, and I didn't remember seeing it on the map. Curious, I slowed down, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of the town. But the highway remained empty, stretching endlessly into the darkness. I dismissed it as a forgotten marker for a town that no longer existed and pressed on. 10 minutes later, I saw the same sign. "Welcome to Pine Hollow." I frowned, glancing at the GPS on my phone. The map showed I was heading in the right direction, but the marker for Pine Hollow wasn't on it. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the road ahead looked eerily familiar. The same curve, the same cluster of trees, the same distant hill. I shook off the unease and kept driving, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. But 10 minutes later, the sign appeared again. "Welcome to Pine Hollow." This time, I stopped the car. The highway was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the nearby trees. My headlights illuminated the sign, its peeling paint and rusted edges giving it an unsettling appearance. I pulled out my phone, trying to make sense of what was happening. The GPS still showed me on the same stretch of highway, with no sign of Pine Hollow. My phone's battery was at 30%, and there was no cell service. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to turn back or keep going. Finally, I decided to press on, hoping the loop would end. The road felt longer this time, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But the road behind me was as empty as the road ahead. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights flickered. For a brief moment, the highway was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, I was approaching the sign again. "Welcome to Pine Hollow." My chest tightened as I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. This time, the sign looked different. It was no longer rusted and weathered. The paint was fresh, the letters bold and bright. Beneath the words, someone had added a line in bright red. "You can't leave." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the sign, my hands trembling on the wheel. I turned the car around, determined to head back the way I'd come. But as I drove, the road refused to change. The same hills, the same trees, the same stretches of empty highway repeated endlessly. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in some kind of loop, a nightmare with no way out. Then, I saw the figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. At first, I thought it was a person, someone who could help me, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't human. Its body was unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, unblinking as it stared at me. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet away from the figure. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed back down the road. Its voice was a low, guttural growl that echoed in my mind, though its mouth never moved. "Turn around," it said. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I sped backward. The figure didn't follow. It just stood there, its glowing eyes locked on me. When I reached the curve in the highway, I turned the car around and drove as fast as I could. But the loop didn't break. No matter how far I drove, the same sign appeared, "Welcome to Pine Hollow." I was running out of gas, and my phone's battery was nearly dead. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. That's when the radio turned on. Static filled the car, loud and jarring. Through the noise, a voice whispered, "There's only one way out." I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I struggled to keep calm. "What do you mean?" I shouted, as if the voice could hear me. The static grew louder, the voice repeating itself. "There's only one way out." Ahead, the road began to change. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, the edges dissolving into darkness. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching toward the car like grasping hands. The figure reappeared in the distance, standing in front of a faint light. I pressed the gas, my car hurtling toward the light. The figure didn't move, its glowing eyes unblinking as I sped past it. The light grew brighter, engulfing the car as the road dissolved beneath me. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was parked on the shoulder of the highway. The sun was rising, its warm glow illuminating the familiar stretch of road. My gas tank was full, and my phone was fully charged, as if nothing had happened. But the sign was still there, "Welcome to Pine Hollow." I didn't stop to question it. I drove away as fast as I could, vowing never to return. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that somewhere out there, Pine Hollow exists, and once you enter, it won't let you leave. I'll start by saying I've always been skeptical of ghost stories. I've read about haunted places and listened to people's eerie experiences, but I never thought I'd have one of my own. A late-night drive down a highway in West Virginia changed that. It was last December, a freezing night with flurries of snow brushing against my windshield. I was heading to visit my cousin for the holidays, taking the kind of back roads where you pass more deer than cars. The highway was lined with trees, their bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the stars. The drive had been uneventful until I reached a stretch of road where my GPS glitched. The soft, mechanical voice that had been directing me suddenly stopped. I glanced at the screen and saw the map flicker before going completely blank. "No service," I muttered, pulling over to figure out my next move. I was fiddling with my phone when I noticed something odd. A faint light flickering through the trees. It wasn't a car, no headlights, no sound, just a pale, pulsating glow that seemed to move in slow, deliberate waves. Curiosity won over common sense. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold night, the snow crunching under my boots. The air was eerily still, the silence pressing against my ears as I moved toward the trees. As I got closer, the glow grew stronger. It had a strange rhythm, like it was blinking in some kind of pattern. For a moment, I thought it might be a campsite or maybe a lone street light. But then the glow stopped. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. The forest was pitch black now, and I felt a sudden wave of unease. Turning back to my car seemed like the smart thing to do, but before I could move, the light reappeared. This time behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding. There, in the middle of the highway, was an old truck. The truck looked ancient, its frame rusted and its windows fogged over. Its headlights blinked on and off, casting an eerie glow across the snow-covered road. I hadn't heard it approach. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to get back in my car. But as I moved, the truck's engine roared to life, the sound loud and guttural, like a growl. Without thinking, I bolted for my car, my boots slipping on the icy pavement. The truck didn't move, but its headlights followed me, turning as I ran. I reached the car and scrambled inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys. The truck's lights blinked once more before shutting off completely. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The truck was gone, swallowed by the darkness as if it had never been there. I told myself it was just some prank, a bored local trying to scare travelers. But as I pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few miles later, I saw it again. The same truck was parked on the shoulder, its headlights flickering weakly. This time, there was someone standing beside it. A man. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move as I approached, just stood there, his hands resting on the truck's hood. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. Something about him felt wrong. His posture was too stiff, his stillness too unnatural. As I passed, he turned his head to follow me, his face illuminated briefly by my headlights. His eyes were completely black. I floored the gas, the tires skidding on the icy road as I sped away. My chest was tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. The highway seemed endless, stretching on and on with no sign of civilization. Then, up ahead, I saw the truck again. It was parked in the middle of the road this time, blocking my path. The man was standing beside it, his black eyes locked on me. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet away from the truck. The man raised a hand, pointing at me with one long, bony finger. The radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. Through the noise, a voice whispered, "Turn around." I stared at the man, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The voice repeated itself, louder this time. "Turn around." I threw the car into reverse, my heart racing as I backed away. The truck's headlights flared once, blinding me, and when I blinked, the road was empty. The truck, the man, the voice, everything was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station an hour later. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, my face pale and my hands trembling. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night, but every time I see a flickering light on the highway, I feel a chill run down my spine, because I know that somewhere out there, the truck is still waiting for its next traveler.